In the last two episodes, we talked about objects and object constructors, and in this episode, you're going to learn how to use objects inside a real project so we can actually see how we use objects inside JavaScript. Now, I did say in the last episode that we're going to build a game inside the browser, so that is what we're going to do in this episode. But I do want to point out that building a game using JavaScript for like a browser is something that is it's not difficult depending on the game, but it's something that is slightly more advanced than what we did in the previous project. So if you watch this episode and you start thinking this is way too complicated for you, don't get frightened away by this episode. It's very important for me to say, because what we're going to do today is we're going to challenge ourselves a little bit using JavaScript, because JavaScript has a very specific way you need to think about it when you code using JavaScript. So you need to sort of change your mindset to JavaScript compared to like HTML and CSS and that sort of thing. So on a side note to that specific comment, building a game, I could have made something very complicated for this episode, and I could also have made something very non-complicated, depending on how long I want this episode to be. I had a lot of ideas in mind for this episode, for the video game that we're going to build. You can actually see it on the side here. And I scratched away a lot of the ideas because they would take too long to build together with you. So I sort of narrowed it down to the bare bone video game that you see in front of me. So that's what we're going to do today. Now, I just want to point out that in case anyone sort of jumps into this episode in the middle of the course without having seen the previous ones, this is a follow-up on the previous lessons that we've learned in this course so far. So this is not a how to build a complete video game episode. At least that's not what I'm focusing on this episode. This is going to be how to build a simple video game using what we've learned so far, especially using objects and object constructors. So now that I mentioned that, we can actually go ahead and see what we're going to build for this episode here. So as you can see in front of me, I do have a completely clean index page with just a link to a style sheet and a font that I found on Google. And I have a style sheet that I used in order to style the video game. We're not going to do the style sheet in this episode. We might do that in a last episode following up from what we're going to do here, because a lot of people complain when I do styling in my episodes. So I'm not going to do that in the first episodes of this course here, of this project here. So these are the clean files that we're going to be working with once we get started on the video game together. Now the finished version, which is over here, as you can see, we have a couple of things going on inside the game. We have a text at the top that says, play the greatest RPG ever to be made. And I don't really think we can call this an RPG. This is probably more like a battle arena style game, if I had to put some kind of name on it. Where you can choose a character. So it says choose a character. Each of these characters have different stats. So they have different health, speed, agility, mana, that sort of thing. So depending on which one you choose, they're going to have different strengths and weaknesses. Now you will be able to see them once we do actually choose the character. That might be something we could have changed, so we can actually see them in here in the selection screen. But we're not going to do that for this episode. So if I were to choose something like the Rogue and go in here, you can see we get into a fight screen where you can find an enemy. It says up here in the task. You can see the Rogue that we chose and the different stats. You can search for an enemy, and you can see we have an arena down here, so we have sort of a battleground between us and the enemy. If I choose search for an enemy, it's going to select a random enemy that I created inside the code. So we have many different types that could randomly potentially be the enemy that is chosen. So if I click search for an enemy, you can see we get a troll in this case, and it also has different stats and that sort of thing depending on which enemy gets chosen. So I have in this case a troll and I have a goblin, I think, inside my code. So these are the things that we're going to build in this episode. And then once we click attack, it's going to give us a pop-up that says you hit 15 damage 6 times. Now the damage, the amount dealt, is going to depend a lot on your strength. So right now the Rogue has 100. Which is somewhere mediocre, at least in my game here. And the agility is going to depend on how many times you hit using your character. So in this case, 6 times, because the Rogue is not as strong, but he hits many times. And the Warrior is very strong, so he hits hard, but fewer times, if that makes sense. So if I click OK, you can see that I hit first, because my speed is higher than the Troll. The Troll has 150, I have 200. Then if I click OK, it says the enemy hit me 17 times, 4 times, back the other way. I can click OK. And then you can see the stats change. So now my health is 32 and the troll has a health of 110. So it sort of changes, and you can sort of continue attacking. If we were to hit the enemy and our health, their health goes to 0, then it's going to end the game saying you won. My original plan was that once you beat an enemy, you jump to the next enemy, and then you would have a sort of counter that would say how many enemies did you beat, and then you would have a score at the end. Now, because of time, and because I didn't want to make this too complicated, that is not how we're going to do it. It's going to be very simple. You beat an enemy, and then it's going to tell you, if I was to do it again, and we are still going, apparently. There we go. I win, or you win, refresh the browser to play again. That's how we're going to do it. And then you just refresh the browser and start over. And again, it's a very simple game to teach you how to use objects and object constructors in JavaScript. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go inside my clean version that we haven't finished yet, that we're going to build together. And we're going to go ahead and start building this game together. So I just want to point something out. When it comes to JavaScript, and this is something I might have mentioned before, there's many ways to get to the same goal. So if you want to create some code that does something specific in JavaScript, there's no right and wrong way to do it. There is a efficient way, of course, and then there's an inefficient way, and then there's everything in between. And any way you might use to reach the goal that works is a valid way to do it. And again, this is just to mention that we're going to do it in one specific way in this episode here. And if you have another way of doing it, then you can try it out. If it works, then it works. And go ahead and build the game the way you want it to. But I'm just going to go ahead and follow one specific path to create this game. And then you can sort of follow it with me if you want to. So what we're going to do here, first of all, is I'm going to go ahead and create some HTML code inside my index page. What I'm going to do, if I were to go back to our game here, is actually let's go ahead and click into a character. There we go. You'll notice that we have different sections inside the game. We have a header up here at the top that has a task inside of it that says what you need to do. Then we have a player, which is shown here, that has all the stats and the pictures or the avatar inside of it. And then we have a an actions area where you can actually get the buttons that says what to do what. And then we have an arena area, and then we have an enemy area. So we have many different sections inside this game, and that is created using HTML. So if I were to go inside my index page here, what I can do is I can say, for example, I need to create and again, I'm just going to use divs for this episode. You could use sections, like section HTML tags, but I'm just going to go ahead and use divs just to make it easy. So I'm going to go ahead and use a div. And I'm going to go ahead and name this div header, which is going to contain all the tasks and the text and that sort of thing that goes at the top of the game. Then I'm going to create another container. We can actually just copy paste what we have here. And this one, I'm going to go ahead and call interface. Interface is going to be where we have our whatever our character is. So right now we have the avatar, we have the text and that sort of thing. So that is going to be interface. Again, you can name it whatever you want. I'm just doing this because it makes sense to me. I'm going to go ahead and copy paste it again because we're not done yet. And the next one, I'm going to go ahead and call actions, because that is going to be the buttons that we have down here, which says, search for an enemy and attack and that sort of thing. I did originally plan, again, to have attack, defend, and dodge as different actions you could do. And again, that became way too long. I could easily do it, but the episode would get way too long, so we're not going to do that in this episode here. So I'm going to go and call this one actions. If I spelled that correctly, I did so. The next section down here is going to be what is the arena, because right underneath the actions we have the arena. So I'm just going to paste it in again. And I'm going to change the name to arena. And then the last section at the bottom is going to be the enemy. So I'm going to just call this one enemy. Again, you can call it whatever you want to. I'm just going to call it enemy here. So now we have the different sections. And what we're going to do is, using JavaScript, we're just going to go ahead and fill in content into these boxes depending on what stage we're inside the game. So we could say that stage 1 is choosing a character. Then when we do something, it's going to jump to stage 2 and it's going to bring the information with it of the character we chose. And then it's going to create stage 2 where we have the actual character. Then stage 3 is going to be after we find an enemy. And then stage 4 is going to be when somebody loses or somebody wins. So this is how the game is going to be. So what I'm going to do first inside the header here is I'm going to go ahead and create the text that we have here at the beginning of the RPG. So right now it says play the greatest RPG ever to be made. So I'm going to go inside the header and I'm just going to go ahead and create a paragraph and insert the text inside of the paragraph. Then underneath here, I'm going to create we could call it an H2 tag. I know that SEO wise, you need to have an H1 tag on each page, but this is not that important of a header. So I'm just going to say choose your character is going to be a header 2. And afterwards, we're going to go ahead and fill in the interface. Now, right now, what we have here with all the characters, I just inserted inside the interface. We could also insert it inside somewhere else, but the interface seemed like the right option for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create the first character we have in here. I do want to point out that I borrowed pictures from another, what do you call it, an MMORPG game that you can find out there. It's the most popular one you can find. So I don't own these pictures. And again, I think it's okay as long as this is just a lesson and we're not going to publish any sort of worldwide game with it. So what I have inside my root folder, as you can see, I have my index page, my style sheet. I have an image folder, and inside the image folder, I have the arena background picture, which is going to be just the transparent text that you see here. And I also have a folder called avatar-enemies and avatar-player. Inside the player folder, we have all the player avatars. I just call them goblin. This should actually not be goblin, that should be rogue. We can actually delete this one. That is a mistake on my side. So we have hunter, mage, rogue, and warrior. And if I were to go inside enemies, you can see we have goblin and troll. So these are the avatars that I chose for this game. Again, if you want to get all the lesson files from this, you can download them on my Patreon in the description of this video. So I will have a link down there. If not, then just find something on Google if you want to use something else. Just know, copyright infringement. If you want to release a full game, then you need to have permission or create your own art. Just FYI. So I'm going to reference to these images when we do actually reference to the player over here. So what I'm going to do inside the interface is I'm going to create the first character that we can actually choose. So I'm going to create an anchor tag, and I'm just going to go and leave the hyperreference as a hashtag, which means that we're going to leave it empty. Now, we won't be going to another page when we do actually choose a character. Instead, using JavaScript, we're going to replace the content inside these different sections inside the index page. So we're always going to stay on the same page inside our game here, which is kind of a neat feature of JavaScript. So what I want to do is I want to first of all insert the image for my character. In this case, if I were to go back, you can see we have the warrior, which is the first one. So I'm going to create an image. And I'm going to link to the actual image inside my root folder. I do actually have the path over here next to me because I do have notes on the screen next to me. So I'm just going to go and copy in the path. Again, if you created a different folder system, then link to your image the right way that you did it. The next thing we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just create a alt because that's important for warrior. For SEO optimization. Then afterwards, we're going to go ahead and create the character's title and description, which is right over here next to the image. So I'm going to go down to the next line and I'm going to create a empty div box. Well, it's not going to be empty, but we're not going to have a class inside the div box. And we're just going to go ahead and insert the text that we want to have inside for the character. So I'm going to say we have an H3 that is going to be called warrior. And then I want to create a paragraph. And I'm just going to go ahead and paste in the text that I have over here in my notes. I'm just going to go ahead and say copy and paste. Where is it? Right here. Now do notice that the text sort of describes what the character has in strength and weaknesses. So right now we do have a higher health and stamina, but the strength is also what makes them slower and clumsier and that sort of thing. Clumsier meaning that he doesn't hit as many times. So I do have a small description that sort of describes what exactly the character can do ability wise. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go ahead and copy our character, which is the anchor tags, and I'm just going to go ahead and paste it 3 more times underneath it, and then I'm just going to change the text and the different links that we have in here. So the second one is going to be the rogue, according to what I have over here. So rogue. I'm just going to change the alt inside the image as well. So it says rogue. And I'm going to go ahead and change the text, and I do have it on the side here, so I'm just going to go ahead and copy it and paste it in. Again, you can choose whatever text you might want for your game. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the mage. Now, I could have made this even easier and just not include a mage, because that would require us building mana into the equation, but I thought it'd be kind of funny to have something a little bit different. So we also have a mage in this specific game here. And again, I'm just going to sort of copy paste what I have over here. If this goes too quickly for you, just go ahead and pause the video so you can see what I wrote for my text. You can probably see it on the side over here as well. And the last one is going to be the hunter. I'm going to say hunter, hunter, and we're going to go ahead and copy paste here. The notes are sort of here to make everything easier for me so I don't make as many mistakes, because there's a lot of things we're going to keep track of in this episode. Hunter. And there we go. So now we have all different, what you call, characters inside our game. So if we were to refresh over inside our version of the game, you can see we have very big images, first of all, because we haven't started using CSS. But we have the character, we have the title up here. Then we also have the text for we have all the stuff we created inside our HTML documents. Everything is here. The only thing I want to sort of change is the fact that the images are very big, because that might ruin it for us. So just for now, let's actually go and change the size of the images, so just so we can see what's going on. So I'm just going to say we have an image, and I want to style it, and I want to create a width set to, I don't know, 160 pixels. Let's actually refresh, see how big that is, and that's much better. So just for now, so we can see what's going on, just note this right here is the exact same thing as this over here. The only difference is that I included CSS styling to this example here, and in this version here we don't have any CSS styling. CSS and HTML is very basic. It's something you should know going into JavaScript. So again, we're going to have a CSS lesson after we're done creating the actual functionality of the game, but you should know how to do this by yourself if you want to have something that looks like a video game. Just sort of throwing that out there. So I'm going to go ahead and go back inside the index page, because we're not completely done yet. Right now, if I were to click a character, nothing is going to happen. If I were to click this character over here, you can see nothing happens. And that's because we need to go ahead and tell it using JavaScript that we want to run a method once we do click the specific character. So inside the anchor tag, and that's the reason we needed the anchor tag, because we need to actually do something when we click it, I'm going to create a onClick event that is going to tell the browser that once we click this specific character, it needs to run a specific function or method in this case. So what I'm going to do inside the onClick is I'm going to say we have, well, for now, let's actually not go ahead and fill it out, because it's just going to confuse you, because we haven't actually created the objects yet. So let's just go ahead and copy let's actually go ahead and copy the onClick event and just paste it down inside the other anchor tags. There we go. In case you wondered how I did this by doing it multiple places at once, I just simply hold down Control, and then I continually click inside my code, and I can write many places, just in case you want to know. Because I get asked that quite often when I do my tutorials here, so I just want to throw it out there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to set up the different objects that we're going to use that is going to create the different characters in the JavaScript code, because even though we created the characters in our HTML, we haven't actually created the characters inside the JavaScript yet, and that is something we need to do in order to be able to do something with the stats of the characters and take away health and that sort of thing. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a new folder inside my root folder. Now, when you have a lot of JavaScript files, because we will have a couple different files in this episode to organize things, it's good to have a JavaScript folder inside your root folder. Just like we have an image folder for all the images. So I'm going to say we have a JS folder. And then inside this folder, I'm going to save all the JavaScript files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to save it inside that folder. And I'm going to save it as gamemanager.js. So gamemanager.js. if I can actually spell it correctly, manager.js. And then I'm going to go and create another file. So I'm going to say file, new file, and I'm going to save this one as player.js. Then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to save it as enemy.js. And again, just to point it out, you don't need to have a different file for each different piece of JavaScript code. This is something I choose to do because it's going to organize which JavaScript code does what, and then places it inside a document that is named after what the JavaScript code belongs to. So if I have code that is going to execute and change the way that the game runs, like changing the arena and that sort of thing, then I put it inside the game manager. If I have JavaScript code that is going to change the player, such as changing the stats, or that is going to run when the player attacks and that sort of thing, I put it inside the player file. And the same thing goes for the enemy file. So it's just a way for us to organize the code in a good way. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and link to these files. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and paste in the JavaScript files we just created at the top here. So right after the style sheet, I'm going to say we have a script tag. And I'm just going to go ahead and say we have a source that is going to link to a JavaScript folder and a game manager. Let's actually spell it correctly. I have a really hard time spelling today. Game manager.js. I'm just going to go and move it up here so it looks somewhat nice. And then I'm going to go ahead and copy the script tag and paste it 2 more times underneath it. Then change it to player.js and enemy.js. So now that we have this, we can actually go ahead and use the JavaScript code inside our our files up here. Now you will notice that when we have specific code that does need to be loaded first before the HTML, then we place it at the top, and then we would have other JavaScript code at the bottom here just to make sure that the content inside the website can load fast. But in this episode, since we're not trying to build a really quick website and instead just build a game, it's very important that all the game elements get loaded first before we get all the visual, things inside the game here. So I'm just going to, use all the code inside these files to get loaded first at the top of the website before we load the HTML that we have down here at the bottom. So that's the way we're going to do in this episode since we're trying to build a game, if that makes sense. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create all the different objects we're going to use for this game here. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a game manager object inside the game manager file. Then we're going to go inside the player file and create a player object. And then we're going to go inside the enemy file and create a enemy object. So we're going to do that first before we start filling in properties and methods inside each of the objects. Now to start with, let's go inside the game manager file. In this example here, we're going to create one object that is going to control what is going to happen to the game in each stage. Now, because we just need to have one game manager object, we're not going to create an object that we can create constructors of. So we're just going to go and create a completely regular object. So I'm going to say we have a let type variable called game manager, or we have an object called game manager that is going to be equal to curly brackets. And again, this is the shorthand for creating a object, just in case you forgot that from our object episode, which is 2 episodes back. And inside of here, we're going to fill in all the different properties and methods that are going to belong to the game manager object. The next thing we need to do is we need to go inside the player file and we need to create a player object. Now in this example here, we need to create many different instances of this specific object. So we're going to create a object constructor. The reason for that is that we have one character that is a warrior, we have one character that is a rogue, we have one that is a mage and a hunter, and we can have even more if we want to. So we need to create copies of this specific object, which means that we're going to create an object constructor. So inside the player object here, or inside the player file, we're going to create a function that is going to be called player with a capitalized P, because this is a object, parentheses, curly brackets, and then we need to fill in all the different properties and methods we might have for this specific player here. Now inside the player object, there's a couple of different ways we could do this, because like I said, there's many different ways you can create the same thing using JavaScript. We could include properties and methods of the player. which means that we have the properties which would be equal to the stats, such as the health, agility, the speed, mana, that sort of thing. And then we could also go ahead and insert methods into the player. So if the player were to attack the enemy, we would actually have a method inside the player object that would actually do the attacking and calculate the attack and actually change everything inside the game. We could also just have the properties inside the player and then have a separate object with all the moves that the player could possibly do that is going to calculate the attacks and that sort of thing. And because I originally planned to have many different move types, and which would end up becoming a lot of code, I did actually create this project here with a separate object that would control all the moves. So the second thing I mentioned. So that's the way we're going to do in this episode here. So for now, inside the player object, just know we're only going to fill in the properties for the player. And then the methods that the player can actually use are going to be inside a separate object. So inside the player object here, we're going to say that we have this class called player dot, and then the name of the specific property. So in this case, it could be class type, because we need to have the information about what kind of class we chose when we chose the player. So we have a warrior class, we have a rogue class, we have a mage, and so on, so on, so on. So we need to have this information when we bring it on to the next stage, because we will have the warrior written somewhere inside the next level. So if we were to go inside the finished example, you can see we have warrior. If we were to click, you can see that warrior inside above the stats here. So in order to have this, we need to bring the information to the next stage, if that makes sense. So we're going to include the class type. It is going to be equal to class type. Again, if this confuses you, I did talk about this in the previous episode. And before we start writing all the different variables into the parentheses up here, we're just going to go ahead and finish the properties first. So I'm going to go down to the next line, say we have this, and then we have the health, which is going to be equal to health. And then we have this dot mana. I'm not sure if I say that correctly because it's mana or mana, depending on where you come from. And then we're going to down to the next line. We're going to set this one equal to strength. Equal to strength. That is a really tough word to spell if you're not native English. This dot agility. Again, you could add a bunch of other sort of properties to this player if you wanted to. Again, this is just what I decided to create for the player. So if you have something else, you could do that. That is not spelled correctly. Agility. And we have speed at the end here. I hope I didn't make a mistake while I was talking, because I usually tend to do that. And I also tend to whistle into the microphone when I have too many S's going on at once. So when I say speed and this, then I start whistling into the microphone. It's really annoying because sometimes I have to cut it out of my videos. So now that we have this, we do actually have the player object. We do need to, of course, include these inside the parentheses because we're bringing in variables from outside the object. So we need to make sure we include them inside the parentheses here. So we're going to say we have health. And then we have mana. Then we have strength. And then we have agility, which I forgot to put a semicolon behind. That's important. And speed. That would have been a typo at the end of the game if I hadn't seen that. So now that we have this, we do actually have the player object. And now we need to do the exact same for the enemy object. Now the enemy does have the exact same stat info as the player does. So it has health, mana, strength, agility, speed. So we could just go ahead and copy the player object we have here and just paste it into the enemy file. And then we just change the name to enemy. And I do think I might have named my class type a little bit different. Instead of class type, I did actually call it enemy type. Because it's not really a class when you have goblin and troll. That is more of a race, like a fantasy race. So I'm just going to go ahead and call it enemy type here. So now that we have this, we do actually have what we need for the objects. There's one more thing that we're going to do here, which is something that we haven't talked about before. If we were to create a player object constructor, which we learned about in the previous episode, by going down here and saying we have a variable called, let's say, player, setting it equal to new player object, and then just filling in information that we have inside the parentheses. So we have warrior as the first one, and then we have the health at the second one. We can say 200, and so on, so on, so on. If I were to create this inside the global scope, like I just did here, we can easily access the object constructor from inside a method. Now, here's the problem. Inside the game manager object we created, we're going to create a method that is going to create the info that is going to be assigned to the player object constructor. But we can't do that. If I were to create the player object constructor inside the game manager, inside one of its methods, then we can't access the object from outside the game manager object. So it's very important we declare the player object constructor inside the global scope of our files. So the way we do this is by, first of all, deleting what we have here. And instead, we're going to just declare the player object up here at the top. So we're going to say we have a let player, and that's it. So right now we declared the object constructor that is going to be equal to all the different information about the character, but we haven't assigned a value to it yet. So we declared it in the global scope and not inside a method, which means that this specific object is available to us everywhere because it's inside the global scope and not just available to us inside the game manager method. If that makes sense. I hope it does, because it's very important, this little detail here. So what we need to do as well with the enemy is we need to declare the enemy object constructor in the global scope. So I'm just going to go ahead and say we have a let enemy declared at the top here, and that's it. And again, it's very important for me that you understand why we declare object constructors outside objects and not inside objects. So if I were to go inside the game manager object here and create just a random method that we're not going to use later on, called name, say we have a method by creating an anonymous function. And inside this method here, if I were to refer to the player variable we just created outside in the player file, and say we want to set it equal to new player objects, then we didn't declare the player object inside the method here, but instead we just assigned a value to it. And this is very different from if I were to do this and create the player object inside the method here. It's very different because right now we're just assigning the value, which means that the value in the global player object that we created inside the player file up here is now going to be equal to what we just created inside the game manager method. So it's available to us globally inside our files here. It's very important that you understand this, because this is something that will give you errors later on that you're going to pull your hair out of your head trying to figure out why can't you find the player object when you created it. And this is why that you might not be able to find it, because it has to be created in the global scope of your files. So I just went ahead and deleted what we created inside the game manager object, because that was just an example to illustrate a point. And I'm going to go ahead and end off the episode here because it's already quite a long episode. And in the next one, I'm going to go ahead and show you how we can create the different methods and properties. Well, we're not really going to have properties inside the game manager. We're just going to have methods. So we will be creating those together in the next episode in order to make the game actually do something inside the browser. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.